So I'm very glad to having you with us, and especially
Thank
because
you.
you have very specific relations with Želimir Žilnik, and I would like to invite you to present your highlights, let's say.
Yeah, well, there's too many highlights to mention. It's a lifetime of highlights for me now, at least a lifetime of this professional stage of my career, which is, I guess, let's say the postdoctoral stage, the doctor and the postdoctoral stage,
Hmm.
because that's where I first came into contact with Jelimir through the course of my studies. I remember I met him as I was researching the history of Yugoslav film.
Hmm.
Someone suggested that I reach out to him and try to meet him, and I did. And he was, of course, amazingly open and warm and kind toward some young researcher that he had never met, never knew, but he was happy to meet me and to tell me so much about his life and his work. And that was really the beginning of our relationship. So starting out as a researcher and just looking into what exactly he was doing at that time, and let's say what one of the periods that he's most famous for, the 1960s, or specifically the year 1969, with his debut films, his debut feature film, I should say, early works. I
Hmm.
was looking into what he was doing right around that time, including the early short films and amateur films that he made as both a professional documentary filmmaker and also a non-professional member of the Amateur Kino Club in Novi Sad.
Hmm.
So I was really interested in that moment to sort of tie it into the larger history of what was happening at that time in Yugoslav cinema in terms of a new generation, let's say a new wave, for lack of a better term, of film directors and film artists that were getting their hands on equipment, that were getting involved in kino clubs, and eventually getting a chance to direct their own feature-length films or professional projects. So I was looking into that era of his work and trying to sort of see how that all fit in. That was really the beginning. And then later, as I got to know him better and got to know a lot more about his much longer body of work in the ensuing decades across film, across television, across video, and eventually across exhibitions and art spaces and all the different spaces that he touched, I just really became interested in following everything that he's doing and learning about everything that he's doing. In many cases, I've written about some of these different areas or approaches or work that he's put out. And in some cases, I've been involved in putting together shows of his work, whether it be at cinemas or museums or even online or wherever it might be. So it evolved with me from being a researcher to eventually being more of an organizer and a curator around his work. And the final step was becoming a close friend to him and and his dear partner and life collaborator Sarita
Hmm.
Matijevic. So getting to know them just very closely, and in addition to being collaborators and colleagues, being very good friends.
Hmm.
They're my unofficial adopted family here in Serbia. So
Very
yeah,
good.
all those
Yeah.
things kind of marked our kind of like the path of our relationship over the past 10, 15 years, let's say.
Great. So thanks for this presenting this graduate genesis of
Yeah.
connection. But will be nice to have now. Feel free to choose a few spots. Then will be actually a very strong, support of this series of our conversations, and will be very nice to hear from your own point of view what was the crucial, for instance, highlights.
Yeah, well, one of the highlights for me is actually one of the early highlights is this book that you all are working on, because I remember when it first came out in Serbian and how it was one of the rare volumes to deal with his work, to deal with the politics of his work and sort of all the different ethical and ideological constructs that he was sort of channeling and negotiating and dealing with. It was one of the few studies, full-length studies, that actually did that. There had been some other books published on Jelena Žilnik in the past, also in Serbia, not very many, but this was sort of one of the most significant recent attempts And I'm really happy to see that it's now been translated. It's a long time coming that this project has been translated into English, but it needed to be because it's a really important one. And I hope that it's going to sort of open the doors or sort of be the bridge toward further studies on Jelena Žilnik's entire body of work to come eventually in English, so a wide audience or wider audience can read it beyond the former Yugoslav space. So there's been some other attempts also, some that I've been involved with, some that I've just kind of been on maybe the sidelines of. For example, a special issue was published on Jelena Žilnik and Studies in Eastern European Cinema, which is primarily an academic research journal, but a good one. The chief editor is Eva Majerska. She's a professor at University of Central Lancashire in the north of England. And this journal was also a really important early attempt to collect a number of writers writing, researchers and writers dealing with his work primarily in English, but also from a very international perspective, writers from all over the world that have encountered his work and loved it, whether they be based in North America, whether they be based in Europe or Asia or Africa or wherever that might be. So that was another really important attempt.
Mm-hmm.
And then I can think of another highlight that for me specifically, personally, but also I think in this larger collection of written work and research about Jelena Žilnik is the catalog that was made for a major sort of, let's say, a two-part exhibition on Jelena Žilnik that initiated in Germany at Edith Lusthaus for Media Art and eventually traveled to, well, eventually it traveled into Germany, but eventually it started in Zagreb at Galeria Nova, curated by the wonderful feminist collective VHV, WHW. So they put together a wonderful monograph on Jelena Žilnik as a result of this exhibition that also eventually, it was a three-part exhibition. It started in Zagreb, it eventually traveled to Germany, and then its final resting place was at Kunsthalle Wien in Vienna. Excuse me. So this book that they put together was also, I think, a really important exploration of his work and the rare exhibition in the visual arts world on his oeuvre and therefore the rare catalog that's published on him. And I was really happy to be able to contribute. They invited me to contribute an essay, and I did, looking specifically at Jelena Žilnik's sort of, I guess, engagement or visualization of race and ethnicity and how that plays out in the former Yugoslavia and beyond. So those are kind of some wider, I think, highlights in terms of writing and researching about his work, and also how it sort of connects to me and sort of finally having a chance to be able to do a longer and maybe a slightly different study of him than I've done in the past, instead of strictly sort of, I guess, confining him to the history of Yugoslav cinema and what does that all mean. This latest work was more of an attempt to kind of look at him in the international context.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the exhibition did that also. And yeah, I was really happy to be a part of that also.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You mentioned in the beginning, actually, then your graduate, scale in relationship with Žilnik was start up with these different formats, film, short films, video, and other stuff. But it was still keeping in kind of, let's say, production frame of images, and moving images. And I'm curious then, does it anything change in your perspective when the whole production of him starting to be analysis from different perspectives, especially with the curators in visual art, and when it's actually expand in different area, also working with Buden and transforming in a different political analysis instead of just representation of film perspective.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question. It's a complex one. So let's maybe try to go at it piece by piece. I mean, first of all, I would say that I think Žilnik has had multiple careers, or let's say multiple stages of his career. Sometimes those passages between one stage to another has been brought on by socio-cultural or socio-economic or political change, sometimes aesthetic change, sometimes changes in terms of technology or modes of production. But he's one of the rare, fascinating film directors and film artists who, at this stage in his life, has traversed so many different eras and so many different technologies and media with his work. We can start at the beginning and thinking about the use of film material and working sort of, I guess, in more of a documentary mode, thinking about his earlier work and how he was sort of using his camera to participate in the struggle, so to speak, to sort of participate in the internationalist struggle, and thinking about how he moved from film by necessity to working into television, right? So
Mm-hmm.
being
Mm-hmm.
able to do his work or to continue his work in television when channels or let's say opportunities were closed to him in the film world because of his politics, because of his uncompromising and radical stance toward the status quo. So not thinking anything of it in the sense that, well, if I want to continue to make work, I can just do it in the field of television, which wasn't a small thing for a film director at that time because there weren't so many directors in Europe. I guess I would say making certainly none that had had the success that Zilnik had in the feature film world, sort of culminating in 1969 with
Mm-hmm.
his Golden Bear that he won at the Berlinale. There wouldn't be so many directors that would be so eager to jump into television because it would have been seen as maybe a lesser medium, or it would have been seen, well, this is not high art, this is low art. This will not put me on the red carpet at the Berlinale, right? This will put me on no carpet in somebody's backyard in some backwater town or country or
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
Vilnik, of course, is not that type of director, not that type of artist. He fully embraced that opportunity. Let's not be romantic about it in some ways because he had to embrace it. But what he did, that's most important, is in addition to being sort of a pioneer of television docudrama and the
Mm-hmm.
television sort of hybrid piece, I guess we could say, was also sort of figuring out a way to utilize that space and that sort of capacity of transmission to continue his political project and his
Mm-hmm.
aesthetic project. So moving from film eventually into television, moving from television, which at that time he was shooting on film, shooting those works on film, to eventually moving into digital video in the 19 to video in the 1980s and digital video in the 1990s when the means of independent production had shifted under his feet, pretty much under everyone's feet that was making films or feature length sort of fiction films or even feature length documentary films. Being able to capture this new technology, and again, sort of not coming at it from the perspective of, well, this is not 35 millimeter, this is not 60 millimeter, therefore I can't touch anything that would debase me so much. No, Jelena grabs his camera, grabs his videotapes or his digital videotapes or his hard drives or his SD cards or whatever it is, and he goes to work and he does what's really important and what really matters, not just in terms of his cinema, but in terms of what we sort of need to have and need to see in the world of moving images.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, from television eventually into video and into digital video. And I guess the only thing that I haven't seen him do yet is get too much into the digital art world or sort of the media art world. But maybe that's coming in the next stage of his career, and it wouldn't surprise me at all because he's a maestro at everything he touches.
Yeah. So yeah, could be on our own joint intention now is actually build up the website, which could be
Yeah,
more interactive. And yeah, I think then you mentioned something which is very interesting, talking about the technology on the beginning when he actually come up through kino clubs, cinema clubs in Yugoslavia. Then it was kind of a specific pool of um, kind of basic education and technology to the people, then through this concept. And basically, he find very smartly, from the very beginning, the position being under the radar, and then to focus on very precise, strong, critical voice of society, and basically through even then the complexity of studios in the 60s when you have this kind of very complex structure shooting something, then you have to develop in the chemical process and then turning back, and he was find his way, and then through this process of the 90s, what you mentioned, and the democratization of technology was providing completely different approach through technology and to finding more. And I think it's just this line, which is actually connecting previous experience. It's also tracing his own, tension and track, and to keep going to explore the main concept. And basically, for us and for myself, it's very important to follow his conceptual framework, which was constantly, present. And then all these other forms, it was just kind of an instrument to show on a particular, dimension, or displayed on the. And even now, when we're talking about this, it's more interesting than he's not only the author who is presenting on the film festivals. So the film festivals is just one of possibilities to provide his
Yeah.
concept, which is more, present, I mean, in everyday life. So.
Yeah. I well, yeah, just to say something about technology, I mean, I
Mhm,
think that's also one of the fascinating things. He
mhm,
never lets the technology get in the way or to sort of mystify or to sort of create a shroud over what he's doing. So the longest collaboration that Jelena Žilnik had with the cinematographer was with Misha Milosevic, who
mhm,
worked with him throughout the
mhm,
1980s and throughout the 1990s, making some of his best known independent works, and even into the early 2000s. So they collaborated for a long time. And I remember Vladimir mentioned to me, and I talked with it probably a little bit with Misha. I talked about it, but I remember specifically him saying how he appreciated working with Misha because Misha doesn't let the technology get in the way of what really matters. And therefore, he doesn't let the ego get in the way of what really matters, which is really sort of unlocking something within his protagonist, sort of using the camera to enable them to express themselves, to play versions of themselves, but in order to sort of get at some inner truths and hopefully to eventually say something and express something about the world and the society that they're existing in, and what needs to be done to change it. So he's never let the technology get in the way, whether it was working with 16 millimeter, working with video, working on television for the big screen, at festivals and exhibitions, whatever it might be. That's one of the things that I appreciate the most about him. I wrote in my book, this chapter that I wrote on him is something that I come back to a lot because I think it's really important for me, at least. I don't know how useful it is for other people, but I like to think of him as somebody that uses the camera, not like other directors who use it as a paintbrush, something that sort of decorates, or maybe something that beautifies, or maybe something that calls attention to its own supposed brilliance, or whatever it might be. But I would rather say that Jelena Žilnik uses the camera as a scalpel, and he really does that to sort of unearth and sort of unveil and to sort of
mhm,
excise what's happening in society and what's happening with people.
mhm,
Not to call him a doctor because we know that he studied law and he comes from a legal tradition, but he's really a man of the arts and a classical outstanding filmmaker. But yeah, I think of him not so much as using the camera like a paintbrush. He doesn't have time for that, to be honest. I don't have time for that either. In terms of the directors that I love and that really matter to me, those that use the camera as a scalpel and a tool that can sort of unveil and lay bare, I think those are the directors that make the most penetrating work. So that's how he approaches technology.
mhm,
And yeah, that's one of the things that I really find admirable about him and his
mhm,
politics,
mhm,
in
mhm,
terms of
mhm,
filmmaking and his engagement in terms of filmmaking.
mhm. Yeah, I would like to share with you also one thing which is actually constant present in our field. Then, we're working with Jelimir on a very specific level, living in the same town, living in a very small scene, sharing with some thoughts and energy. And basically, I would say then what we are doing with this research project, which we call it continuous art class, it's something which is completely hidden on the radar of public results, let's say. So what we did with Jelnik, it's actually supporting a lot of initiatives in a local, producing also very much production of strength and support civil society in Novi Sad and local organizations. And this is also something which is very connect with this conceptual frame when I mentioned earlier. And it's a question of a process of having a sense of improvising, or actually to carefully listening with the whole group of people then he's involved in it. And this is something that he's also practicing in his projects. Having a script or kind of frame, main frame of the story, and then it's provide a lot of possibilities to go to another directions or to adapt in terms of the characters who is actually involved in the processes. And through this way, how much actually you've been faced with this phenomenon on your process working with him.
Yeah, improvisation, I think, is really important to speak about in terms of the way that he works. You opened up an interesting possibility to think about it in the way that he's involved with cultural organizations and civil society. But if we go back to the films and the videos and the works of art, yes, one of the things that's unique about him is he's considered one of the pioneers of docufiction, or let's say hybrid filmmaking. So what that means is he's sort of freely blending fact and unreality, or irreality, or surreality, or whatever you want to call it. But he does that sometimes through scripted means, but more often than not, I would say, it seems to me, he does it through improvisational means. So he keeps things very open and very fluid in terms of situations that he creates for his performers, for his protagonists. Sometimes he will come in with a very loose scenario, a sort of a roadmap that lets him get where he needs to go, but he always gives opportunity and space to his character to sort of improvise their way around the material. And again, to use that as a way to sort of hopefully express their truth, and express, more important than their truth, I guess, just their reality, and just sort of how they're living, and what they're thinking, and how they're feeling. That's their job, and Jelimir's job is to sort of tie all that together into sort of a larger statement, or sort of a larger narrative about what's happening in society. So improvisation is, I've seen him work, and the way he works, and how he really trusts performers, and empowers them, and sort of gives them the opportunity to be what they want to be on camera, and to say what they want to say. And that sort of freedom comes across in, I think, this method of improvisation.
Mm-hmm.
So that also gives his cinema a very sort of free, and sort of a liberated sort of quality to it. This sort of unique, independent quality to it, in the way that he sort of goes about things. So improvisation is something that we should talk about a lot. And it's not just with the characters, it's not just with the
Mm-hmm.
protagonists, it's
Mm-hmm.
also obviously with the camera work, and how that camera work is able to sort of to capture these stories, and to sort of participate in these stories, and all the way into his scenario construction. I remember a story from dearly departed Branko Vucicevic, one of his early collaborators and one of his earliest friends in the film world.
Mm-hmm.
And he mentioned to me how they put together the script for Early Works, this film that they co-wrote together in 1969. He
Mm-hmm.
said they literally pasted it together. It was literally held together by spit, and tape, and chewing gum, fragments of scenes. I wish that script would have survived. Clearly, it was too fragile, but that would have been an amazing sort of avant-garde work of art. But just this idea of improvising in relation to the scenario, and how to create a scenario, and leaving space for sort of illumination to kind of sneak into the work. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and in terms of the work that he does with civil society and with organizations, Jelan Jelnik has always been very interested and very excited in working with students and working with young people. He's teaching workshops all the time, whether it's Novi Sad, whether it's Belgrade, whether it's in Slovenia. He's very much involved in doing master classes, and sort of, again, demystifying the tools and the
Mm-hmm.
technology for a new generation of makers. And that's part of, again, his sort of larger
Mm-hmm.
socio-political and aesthetic project, in terms of sort of inspiring that next generation. So he continues to do that, and I know that's really important to him.
Perfect. I think it actually sounds very good as a conclusion, what you mentioned now, as a summarizing. And I think,
Cut in print.
yeah, exactly.